pleasure to speak to you. I know we've had a couple conversations on the back end of this, and I'm really excited to be able to learn from you today and also have your story shared because it's such an important story to be told. So before we get into the story aspect of it, what I'd love to hear from you and for our listeners here is that tell us a little bit about yourself, your journey, role that you do there.
Yeah, sure. So happy to. So I was trying to make my background a little bit better, but you could still see the other part of my basement. So I'm sorry, it's really not that pretty. But anyway, can you hear me okay?
Absolutely.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so a little bit about myself personally. I am the daughter of two immigrants, Pablo and Esperanza. So I am first generation born and raised here. My mother was Ecuadorian, my dad was Colombian. Have two kids, so I'm married to Jeff Teasdale. So hence I went from Esperanza Escobar to Esperanza Teasdale, which a lot of folks kind of like, what? Those two names are very different.
Fusion.
Power of marriage. Yeah. um, I have a little dog. He's in the background here. I really hope he doesn't bark during this session. I'll be embarrassing, but it's real. So yeah, I went to college to study engineering. So I'm the first in my family to go to college in the US. So my path to marketing and what I do today, not linear at all. Very different, unique experiences that got me to where I am. So I worked in a plant with a hard hat and steel toe shoes for 5 years. I went to a sales gig, and then in sales, I said, "Hey, this marketing thing is really cool. It's just so influential to what a company does." That I went on to get my MBA at UConn. So that's a little bit about marketing. And what I do today at PepsiCo is run the Hispanic business unit, which is a self-sustaining, multidisciplinary team that is just focused on bringing Hispanic insights to our company for the beverage sector, helping our big brands realize the growth potential, and then work with big partners in retail, like the Walmarts of the world or 7-Elevens, to then show them how they can capture that growth potential and preserve, set their business up for success in the future. So that's a little bit about me.
Brilliant. So you're very much working with the Hispanic American communities because they're not monolithic. They are unique and different in every way. And you're connecting them with a Pepsi brand. How do you think, or what do you think is the role of the Hispanic American audiences in context of shaping culture and with Pepsi's larger mission?
Yeah, I think they definitely are shaping culture all the time. In particular, when you think about the values that Hispanics have, family, sport, music, food, those tend to influence where we're going. Those are the beginnings of, new cuisines, new sounds and music. So you're really seeing their impact almost everywhere on a regular basis. And so, our job is to really understand those insights and nuances, and leverage them to just be as culturally relevant as possible. And there's a ton of great work that the ANA is doing right now within this space of recognizing that being culturally relevant is good for business. No surprise there. But, they were able to finally capture via analytics that is true. And companies like ourselves have a responsibility to evaluate that, participate in that, and to help also, commercialize it. So those cultural elements just are really critical. And, you see that all over the place when you see, different folks, singing together in music. You'll bring, rappers together with reggaeton, et cetera. And then all of a sudden they're creating a new sound and a new harmony that you've never heard of before. So that's a perfect example on really just how the music and the tracks that are there tell stories and bring this vibrancy that, continues to evolve really day by day. And even some songs that are COVID inspired, which is really interesting, as people are telling stories more. They're having the time to kind of write things down and process things and say, like, I want other people to hear this and express myself in those ways. So it's really dynamic, the culture.
So you've spoken about culture, and just before our session, Alicia Tillman spoke about, now we're in this area of convergence between our home life and our work life, if you will. But I think it goes deeper than that. What I'd like to do is almost take a step back. So you've spoken about your role at Pepsi. You've spoken about the importance of the Hispanic American community communities and how Pepsi is engaging with them. What I'd like to do is understand more about you in terms of the life lessons that you've had. You opened up by saying you are the child of immigrants. You're the first to go to university, took on a tough degree such as engineering. But what are some of those life experiences that you've had that you've been able to now parlay into the work that you're doing with Pepsi, which makes it even more important and even more personal?
Yeah, I mean, the journey for my parents, and I think in general, you hear this a lot when it comes to Hispanic families and their stories. Like, it's one of resilience, it's one of perseverance, it's one of advancement, and making sacrifices that are for the better. They might be difficult in the short term, but they're really important in the long term. And so those are definitely qualities that my parents, really as my main role models, showed me. My parents could not have the same professions in the US that they had in their countries because of language barrier. My mother was an accountant in Ecuador, a pretty successful one, but she didn't understand the accounting rules in the US, plus not speaking English. She just wasn't going to be doing that type of work. But that said, a lot of what they did was to better their daily life and then provide, for me, and give me opportunities that they never had. So I think those are some of the qualities that, kind of being fierce and forward, that I think I inhibit. I think the ability of helping others is really in my DNA, which is why I do a lot on diversity and inclusion at PepsiCo, because I know I've been supported by many people who've given me a seat at the table, and that's a really important unlock for Hispanic, professionals, is to have that opportunity. And so where I can pay it forward, I do that very, very often, because I know how important it is. And then that just hopefully unlocks a lot of growth. So I think those are the things that really, I think, were like life lessons that helped form me and who I am, and also like knowing, for the most part, like there was a lot of things I was missing, but I didn't realize I was missing them because the environment I was in was really positive. So, while folks were having, getting new versions of Capizios or Jordache jeans, I was getting the Kmart Capizios that actually I bought them too big because they were wide and they didn't fit my foot properly. But anyway, but I had white shoes that looked like it. Like, I was okay with that. And I think that's an important thing to understand, that really what you need at the center of everything is just great values and a structure that makes you feel good and positive and optimistic. And so that's something that I'm trying really hard now with this next generation, which is my kids. And it's a little tricky because you also want to give families and children what you didn't have, but how do you balance it out so they realize, like, wow, like, I should be content with what I have. So anyway, so it's a little bit about.
So, I mean, we've spoken about this idea of the Hispanic American communities having this idea of culture and connectedness. Do you feel like you've been able to draw upon your personal experiences to get that sense of community with the work that you're doing? Because there is a huge intersection there as well.
Yeah, for certain. So, PepsiCo, a few months ago, announced, a partnership with Unidos US, which is the largest Hispanic advocacy group in the country. And that's really important to me because we're able to influence then what can we do as a company? How can our associates volunteer and support education programs, for example, or small business programs, or leadership training programs for folks who are in the community? And so we're actually in a process of building those plans out now. And so that's real active. Hey, how are we helping? Because it's just so important to be there for people when they need it. They don't forget that. They tend to focus a lot on when people aren't there, versus when they are there. But when you are there, it just creates an incredible loyalty and an authentic connection that's really required to be close to people and to drive future business.
So I want to on your career as well. So we've spoken a little bit about, your personal life and the intersectionality with the work that you're doing with PepsiCo. But you did mention that there are people who have helped you along the way. As a woman of color, as an immigrant in corporate America, what are some of the lessons forward and grown in your career that you would be able to share with our listeners today?
Yeah, I mean, being an advocate for yourself is really important. Nurturing those relationships when people extend that hand to you become really important. And you may not see that benefit today, but you will in the future. And I mean, I have an example of, when I didn't take a hand that was provided to me because of a misunderstanding. And that really impacted my career in the longer term. And I learned a lot from that experience. So I think definitely taking that hand when people reach out is critical. The other one is just either ask for a seat at the table, or when you get the opportunity, take it, because that's so important, no matter what level you're at. But having an opinion and elevating your voice is just so important for people to know what you're thinking, how you can add value, and that's also how you stand out too. Surely not saying that, hey, come in with a parade and fireworks all the time, but definitely if you have something to share, it's something incremental, then you should feel the confidence and energy to go ahead and do that. So having a tenacity, I think, is really important too. And then in our org, I'm sure like anywhere, Anas, the relationships you build become critical. Nothing happens with one person. And my mom would always say, like, she was friendly with everyone. It didn't matter. It was like the most senior people in her company. She was worked in a factory, to the folks who were cleaning. Like, it didn't matter who it was. Um, any relationship was an important one to cultivate.
So you're saying advocate for yourself and be everyone, no matter what. That seems like that's the resounding theme. So with that, what I want to do is take us myself from India, Pakistan. I was born in the UK. But what I've experienced is there are times when people want to into one category, or they put the African American, but communities are not monolithic, and you know that in the work that you're doing specifically with Hispanic America. What is some advice that you would, or what is the work that Pepsi is doing to ensure that they are uniquely communicating to the variety of Hispanic communities? And what is some advice that you'd give to other brands as they're engaging with Hispanic communities? Esperanza?
Yeah. So, yep. So I think the advice I would say is, at PepsiCo, we have a model of, nationally great, locally even better. So localization becomes critical, and that's been a learning, I think, for many companies. To your point, Hispanics are not one monolithic, ubiquitous group. Yeah, we might have very similar values, but we certainly have different cultural nuances, celebrations, traditions, and things in our heritage and history that make us really unique. And so, as we think about the future, how we communicate or how we understand Mexican Americans in California will be different than those that might live in Texas or closer to the border. That'll be different from someone who's from a Caribbean country in New York or Florida, or as well as Latin America. So, but understanding that and double clicking on that is something that becomes really important as you go forward, because you can't assume that everyone will relate ubiquitously. There may be some things that feel high level enough that they can be efficiently done and still celebrate the values, but then there's always the opportunity to do more to be more relevant to a specific ethnicity, which is really important. So that's really what we're focusing on as we build new plans for 2021.
Brilliant. So speaking about 2021 and even the work that you're doing right now, what are some of the initiatives that Pepsi is working on? Especially, would love to hear some of those initiatives, but also some of the conversations that you've had around Unmute Your Voice campaign, which has been very impactful, very powerful. Would love the details on that, because I know there's probably been some uncomfortable conversations for it.
Yeah, for sure. So the Pepsi Unmute Your Voice campaign was a real passion project in that a few months ago, as we were looking at, insights, in general around COVID and understanding the experience that Hispanic consumers having, clearly voting and a lot of the questions around it was coming up as a real issue. So, what we then also looked at was the context of today's world. We're all on Zoom, we're all on WebEx, we're on this very connected platform. And the worst thing that can happen is when you're on mute or your video freezes.
Yeah.
No one can process what you're doing or saying. And so we connected that to the fact that, hey, speaking without voting is like talking on mute. No one can hear what you're saying, or no one can hear what your position is, or what your where your support is. And then the third piece was around, the role that brand Pepsi has, ton of heritage and music, and a great brand to really help elevate the voice of our consumers. And so that's really the genesis of this Pepsi Unmute Your Voice campaign, which we then connected to voting and really driving the message for register to vote. It was a passion project because it was really starting with the Hispanic consumer and all of the issues they were thinking about for voting. But then we said, hey, this is a great multicultural youth message. So we partnered with Rock the Vote. And then honestly, we said, you know what, this is a great message. So let's go ahead and put it out there a little more broadly. And that's tough in the sense that we as a company, of course, we have responsibilities to shareholders, et cetera. And being nonpartisan was really important. So there's a lot of internal conversations around that, around the risk, around, all the things about the creation of the message to make sure that we got the message out, which was an important one to deliver, but in a way that felt, really inspiring to people more broadly, versus taking a side one way or the other.
So, and what has some of that insight been? So you touched upon, some issues that are important to the Hispanic American audience. What are some of those issues that drove that conversation that aren't being represented or could be more represented?
Yeah, I think that the biggest challenge was that the registration numbers, typically the conversion from registration to voting is pretty high for the Hispanic base. But what we were seeing was that registrations, were continuing to lag. There hasn't been that much energy around an electoral vote like this, a presidential vote, I apologize, like this since, probably 2008 or Obama's time. So that said, we wanted to serve as a place to drive people to where they could go for more information. That's why we selected Rock the Vote. And then, it came up as an insight around what are some of the things that are happening to Hispanics today that we felt we needed to understand better. A lot of it was coming from COVID. Hispanics tend to have a higher percentage of frontline workers. They have, more unemployment, and at times they can't necessarily benefit from an unemployment payment. They have issues with then sending money to their countries, because if they don't have money for themselves here, how do they send remittances to other parts of the family? And so there's just a lot of things we were seeing that were really concerning, which I think also, goes back to PepsiCo's commitment to the Hispanic community, specifically through Unidos and some other organizations where we know they need our help and we want to be there.
Do you feel like brands of different community? Is it good for brands to do that, or should they have more of a stand back approach? Because we are in a world where consumers want to go with brands with purpose, but there's a fine line, which you mentioned. So what do you think is that role for PepsiCo, but also for other brands? Should they be in this space, or should they be agnostic?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, obviously for us taking action on a brand like Pepsi when the company's called PepsiCo, it has a definite enhanced amount of review and discussion. But, in Cannes Lion earlier this year, they kind of summarized a lot of what they recommended in 3 areas. The first was companies or brands to create action, not ads. The second was to improve how we represent humanity. And the third was for brands to balance out the short-term and the long-term needs. And so what I gravitated toward in talking to my boss and the senior executives at the company about this idea was like, hey, this is our time to take action and not create an ad. And so the context of what was happening in this moment also really drove the energy behind doing that. And I do think folks, appreciate a thoughtful message. There's always going to be a hater in one way or another. You can't avoid it no matter what. But taking an action done in a thoughtful way, I think is an important risk that has great reward and relevancy to today's consumers.
So you brought up you said an important part. You said create action, not ads. As a guy who's here at Stagwell Group, we are a marketing communications company. And obviously, part of what we do is ads. So what is your advice to your agency partners? If it's not ads, what types of action-based messaging should we be putting forward?
Yeah, I think it comes from understanding your community, your key strategic target. Like who is it that you're looking to build your brand equity with? And then understanding them across many dimensions will help unlock those places where you can then think about, well, how do you help, from a societal perspective, for example. And there's many ways and forms that action can take, of course. Ours was specific to voting registration, but my goodness, there's so many different places and passions that people have. But I think being as insightful as possible and authentic as possible are probably the two key things that are highly recommended for a brand and an agency to consider. And I'll be honest, like if you find that you're at an agency where, let's say, your target is X, does the team working on that project look like the target? Like, and that's also other conversations we're having internally too, is like driving the diversity of the consumer internally into our company, our teams, our agency partners is really important as well. So that's another type of action.
And, very candidly, we've had these discussions internally as well when we're working on a pitch or an RFP, whatever it might be. And I'm a firm believer that you've got to represent what you're trying to represent. Right. It's a two-way street on that representation. You're trying to engage the BIPOC community, but you don't have a BIPOC community. You've got to fix that as well. Also, you're going to represent that. So we've had those conversations. We're making strides towards it, but that's a reality as well. We are in this COVID era where everyone is trying to get growth, but I think Raja Rajman, our CMO over at MasterCard, said it best: you want to serve, not sell. Mm-hmm. So what are some of the ways, and you could touch on addition, you've spoken about Unidos and so forth, where PepsiCo is serving rather than selling to really help this idea, or not the reality of helping humanity?
Yeah. I mean, there's two that come to mind. One is an initiative that one of my peers has launched in our South Division, and it's called Stronger Together, and it's a community initiative to help bring in our Pepsi workforce to connect to the community by using industry leaders, entertainers, athletes to create this give back model. So that as we're working through things, we're finding opportunities to connect everything we have access to give back. So that campaign, Stronger Together, has had a wonderful reception, not only in the marketplace, but by our associates. It's like it created this groundswell of partnership and humanity within our own associates, which then obviously translates to the market. So it's super cool. Then another one is our Water Plus team, our Life Water team, just launched a Life Water Black Artists series online, and I'd love for them to have the opportunity to talk about it at some point on Brand Innovators. But Life Water obviously celebrates the artistry and diversity, and they created a series that is inspired by Black artists. It's beautiful work. So those are two great examples of two different teams and two different colleagues who've done incredible work to show what give back could look like.
Brilliant. And from your experience as you've worked with the Hispanic audience, what would you say are some misnomers that people have when trying to engage the Hispanic community that they need to overcome?
Yeah, I mean, I think depending on how you segment the Hispanic consumer,
Yeah.
They may benefit from communication in Spanish or English. So you can't assume that Spanish is the absolute all the time. We have a target that we call Fusionista for brand Pepsi, and that consumer lives in both worlds pretty seamlessly, American culture, Hispanic culture. They're weaving in and out of it all the time. Sometimes they're taking in content in Spanish, and sometimes it's in English. But then we have a cohort that's called a preserver, which is much more ingrained in their current culture. And so Spanish is really more important there. So I think language, the power right now of technology is great because you can personalize anything at any time. So knowing when to do that becomes really important. And I think, like we were talking before, Hispanics are not one, homogenous group and just say it this way and it's good. I am Latin American. I am learning so much from my current team on Mexico. There's so many different celebrations, traditions, foods, ingredients, music, everything that I never was exposed to because I'm Latin American. So I think also, tapping into those, either folks who have the culture in their DNA or subject matter experts that might not be on your team but outside, becomes really incredible as sources of learning to help you be as relevant as possible.
So I like that you said that in terms of the different audience segments out there, because I just think about myself, like my first language is English, but my parents speak Urdu/Hindi, and even though I have working knowledge in terms of speaking, my parents, I understand 100%. And like it's being able to navigate between Indian films and Pakistani dramas to American films and being of the moment in the culture that we're living in today, and respect to the culture that you came from. So I think that that's really important to be able to toggle. But for brands, I think that's just as important as well. Like I think we spoke earlier about the impact that the Hispanic diaspora is having on culture. When I think about like crossover artists, I think that's a really big piece as well. So like in particular, when I see Priyanka Chopra on TV, I'm like, yeah, she's come from India. She's making it. She's like, I would say she was like, or she for the Indian diaspora is probably like what Selena was to some degree. Even before J-Lo, it was Selena, right? She was huge. So there's been those crossover artists. Do you think it makes sense for brands, and I know Pepsi works with a massive roster of celebrity talent, to tap into these global talent houses that represent different pieces of different communities globally?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we tapped into Pitbull over the weekend with respect to the Pepsi Unmute Your Voice campaign, and he has a real passion for leveraging his voice to do good, and he was an incredible partner there. There's a great article, I think, in the New York Times on Bad Bunny and his authenticity and how it's paid off, right? Like, whereas before he might have been forced to just, rap or perform in English. He could do whatever he wants, right? And he's showing the value of that and how incredibly creative he is. So I think that, for certain, finding what I'll call positive role models is really important. And those can take place at any time, anywhere, big or small. But that's probably another key element in driving cultural relevance. And again, the ANA work, has a criteria for how to drive that relevancy, and positive role models is one of the core ones to driving that, versus maybe stereotypical visuals or, narratives around, Hispanics in one way or the other. But yeah, absolutely the power of, celebrities and folks who have a great story as to how they excelled, right? Everyone's got a journey.
That's right. Absolutely. Which I'm going to start asking you. People really want to learn more about your journey in particular. So the first question we have is, did you have a professional mentor early on in your career? And how did that relationship impact your journey?
Yes, I did. It was one of my first, amazing bosses at PepsiCo, Danielle Vona, who was incredible. She's just an incredible leader. She provided multiple opportunities for me to join her team, and just she taught me a lot about managing, in a big organization like PepsiCo, especially with senior executives and kind of working toward building a confidence and experience on how to communicate productively in those settings. So yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I've had mentors like for a long time. And even early on in my career, I had someone create a job for me where it didn't exist, because they realized how passionate I was about going into marketing and I'll never forget that person about that. But yeah, always like you find mentors, kind of quick. Like you kind of look around, you're kind of like, oh yeah, I'd like them, I'd like them. Then the art is like, well, shoot, how do I reach out? Like, do I just send an email or do I have a Zoom meeting? Like, I don't know what to do, but you just find something really relevant to talk to them about. And that's, you got to break the ice somehow. You got to be courageous enough to just kind of, if you see somebody, you're like, dang, I wish that person was my mentor. And, don't hold back, make it happen.
Absolutely makes sense. And I've done the same thing multiple times in my career. The worst that could happen is they say no.
Exactly. And sometimes they land in your lap, sometimes they don't, but yeah.
Yeah, but if you don't try it, the answer is the same. Versus if you do try it, the answer can be in your favor.
Right.
So the next question we have is more around media budgets, as is really important as we look at what's happening in the world. So the question is, many brands have drastically reduced media budgets over the past few months. Has your media plan adjusted? Or if your budget has been reduced, have you gotten more creative and efficient with your strategies? Ooh.
Yes. So the answer is yes. I mean, I won't talk about numbers specifically, but yeah, I mean, everything is pointing to being creative with how you build creative, right? Content. We have a great internal capability, our creator studio, led by one of my colleagues, Lou Arbetter, and they do great work. They're great storytellers. So there's this balance of, hey, what can we do internally? What can we do externally? And then, being nimble too, because I think gone are the days of like, hey, we have to have like the meeting before the meeting before the meeting before the meeting, and then like each meeting, like 1 million people are there, and then 500,000, and then 20, and then 2. Like that formality, I feel like has totally gone, at least from the context that the current situation I'm in. We're more nimble. We're like, hey, let's have, we're having a creative review. Okay, here we go. And we're being very quick on feedback, not sitting on stuff, and really, one thing I think that has been really great, and Alma is our agency working on the Pepsi stuff for Unmute right now, but letting them do, as long as the brief is good, they're going to do great work. They really are. And so, and sometimes that's hard because sometimes as a client, you're kind of, very married to everything. But I feel like we've had to be a lot more flexible and nimble in stuff. And then a lot on digital. Man, digital is, you can localize, you can turn stuff on faster. There's an efficiency there. And a lot of things we're seeing are pointing to, much more digital social. And that also helps with the scenario if, budgets are kind of like squeezed, you get more out of that. And it's sometimes closer to conversion too, versus some traditional media. So
So it sounds like you're pivoting as well, just like everyone else. It's indicative of the landscape.
Pivot every day.
Every day, multiple times a day. So speaking about social, the next question we actually have is about emerging media. How do you approach emerging media channels, and how do they factor into your overall strategy? So we know you love it digital because you can on and off. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, as part of this current campaign, we're doing some stuff. We did some stuff with Natively and Live V Live. So that was a new music platform that I guess Pitbull created, knowing that people can't go to concerts anymore. It's that online concert now. So, you pay a lower price, but hey, you're getting your concert, in your living room. So that was new. That platform was just created, and so we leaned into that. We have a balance of, let me see if I get this language right, because our OMD friends are our partners here on it, but of like proven media, test and learn, and then real disruptive. So like across those three strategies, we have things. So there's things that we know are tried and true. There's things that are new and upcoming, and then there's things that are like, oh my gosh, like we've never done this, but let's check it out. So for sure, we try to check off all of those boxes because that's the only way to kind of come up with, hey, what's the new progressive thing to do? That balances like performance and culture. What's tried and true performance, but what's really culturally relevant? We got to do it right now because it's like, so.
I like that. It is performance and culture. It is definitely that toggle between the two.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's easy to lean towards performance, right? But you gotta push on culture. You have to.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's like it's literally like instinct versus science, right? Like
yeah.
One's quantifiable completely, but the other one is just that gut instinct, and there has to be weight given to the culture, given to instinct, because there is an intangible that you lead with. But finding that balance, that's the holy grail. That is definitely the holy grail. So then my next question to you is, as leaders, you're always developing your abilities. What skills would you like your marketing team to develop this year?
Yes. So by default, we've all built up agility, sorry, as a skill, because literally everything changed, from one day to another. Empathy is the other one, not only on the consumer side, because it's really important to us as a company, and to all the work you do, but as people, because we have a very diverse team of professionals, incredibly talented. Everyone's got a different story, comes from a different background. And we've spent a lot of time talking about everything that's happening in this country, in this world. And so having that empathy to really listen and learn, is so important right now. And it's uncomfortable. Some folks are very uncomfortable with it. And understandably, but having the conversation around it, I think helps to open people's eyes up to other experiences and maybe other ways to work toward a better sentiment, a better camaraderie, a better, almost like humanity about what we do. But and the other thing is like our teams have just really gotten to know each other really well. We know people's husbands, dogs, babies, house projects. My goodness, a whole host of things. It's really incredible. And so I know Alicia said this before too, that, in tough times, afterwards, the recovery, like there is a silver lining and there's positivity. And so I feel like, unfortunately what's happened is happening, but it's meant to be because there's something else on the other side that's just going to uplift things. There has to be. It's a learning moment for us as people and as our country. And on the other side will be a better outcome. There has to be. We all have kids and families that are going to live in that. So we certainly want to leave it in a better place too for them.
Absolutely. And I'm loving the optimism. I'm right there with you on that. And interesting enough, the next question is, has your leadership past few months, and have you been able to develop more personal relationships with your colleagues and partners? It sounds like you have, but would love for you to go deeper in that journey.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've always been pretty flexible and empathetic. I think, and very quick to decide. And so we did a Hogan survey, which is kind of like Myers-Briggs. You know what I mean? Like actually Hogan is a little different, right? It's talking about your strengths and then your blind spots, and then it really goes into here's what can happen with your blind spots that could be really, really bad. So keep that in mind. Do this. But one of mine is is kind of like a whimsical, quick to decide, so overly optimistic that I'm like, oh, just go. And so I've had to pivot myself a little bit to kind of say, like, you know what, if the rest of the team isn't there, okay, I'm gonna pull back a little bit. If you guys are more thinkers or, or more strategists or whatever, great. I'll pull back a little to let you guys work through that, and then we'll decide. So that I'm not as impulsive sometimes. And then that flex is something that I've been required to do in a way to then help the team realize that, okay, like, you know, we've got a point of view, we've got an opportunity on how to do something. And because sometimes other people might require more information, you know, more conversation, whereas I'm kind of like, quick, okay, let's go. And I'm like, oh, all right, I'm going to hold back. And so I've consciously held back a little bit just to recognize that. So yeah, I've had to flex and be more agile too.
Brilliant. We've got one last question here, and that is, what trends in consumer behavior are of particular importance to you and marketers right now? How are they consuming media differently, and how are they interacting with brands differently?
Yeah. I mean, the one thing that I'm very conscious of right now, especially with the work I'm doing on the Hispanic consumer, is just making sure that my organization is aware on how COVID is disproportionately impacting Hispanics. So what our team focuses on is elevating those insights and implications. The one I would say that it might sound simple, but we all have phones, you know, we're all, you know, attached to our phones and everything. But for Hispanic consumers in general, the phone is a lifeline. Like it's more than just, hey, I gotta text somebody. We might be sitting in our homes today. We've got a laptop, you know, we've got a desktop, we've got all this other stuff at hand. We've got Wi-Fi, no problem. But for Hispanic consumers, the phone becomes that lifeline to everything. It's more economic for them to buy a phone than it is to have any other big setup on their computers. And so, yes, they're using it for shopping, for listening to music because it's a mood enhancer, to research things, to get information, you know, on COVID, on the election, you know, to watch streaming shows or music, and then to connect to their families, WhatsApp, and then to transfer money, and then to bank, deposit your check, and then send it out. So it's a lifeline. Like it is an appendage. And we might joke that it is for like teenagers, like, oh, you know, my kid can't let go of the phone. Yeah, no, but that kid's going to be fine without it for a little bit. Or, you know, like they don't, you know, they can consume media or consume another tech to provide, right? And so anyway, that's something that we're really elevating as well, is just how dependent they are on it. And so therefore it becomes a really important way to engage in a positive way.
Perfect. That is super helpful. Well, Esperanza, thank you so much for your time. This has been absolutely amazing. Your journey's fantastic, and I think it's been very inspiring to everyone who's listened in. So thank you once again, and keep on doing what you're doing. The world needs more of it, for sure. Over to you, David.
This was